The fluorescent lights of the Pentagon hummed with an almost menacing persistence as dawn broke over Washington, casting long shadows across maps that showed Soviet missile installations like a constellation of death. In the war room, the air tasted of stale coffee and cigarette smoke, thick enough to choke on, while men in decorated uniforms stared at intelligence reports that predicted the end of civilization with cold, mathematical precision. General Thomas Crawford pressed his palms against the mahogany table, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched so tight it ached, knowing that what they drafted in this room might be humanity's final chance at survival. Outside these walls, American families slept peacefully, unaware that their military commanders were gambling with their very existence. The weight of every soul in every city pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden, making each breath feel harder than the last. This was not how any of them imagined their careers would culminate, not in desperate diplomatic gestures, but in the terrible arithmetic of mutual assured destruction. Yet here they stood, architects of annihilation tasked with becoming angels of peace. The proposal they had spent 72 sleepless hours crafting sat before them in a plain manila folder, its words representing the accumulated wisdom and terror of the nuclear age distilled into 12 pages. Admiral Richard Stanton broke the silence first, his voice gravelly and worn, asking whether they truly believed Moscow would accept terms that required trust between empires built on suspicion. Crawford looked up, meeting the eyes of men who had commanded fleets and armies, now reduced to envoys bearing olive branches wrapped in uranium. They all understood the stakes, the impossibility of their task, the likelihood that pride and ideology would trump survival instinct. The clock on the wall ticked forward with mechanical indifference, each second bringing them closer to either salvation or catastrophe. "Someone had to try," Crawford finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, because the alternative was unthinkable. The document would be dispatched within the hour through encrypted channels to the Soviet premier, a man as trapped by his own military apparatus as they were by theirs. Each concession they offered had been fought over, each paragraph debated with the intensity of men who knew that word choice could mean the difference between peace and oblivion. Crawford sealed the folder himself, his hands trembling imperceptibly, wondering if Khrushchev would see this for what it truly was, not weakness, but the courage to step back from the abyss. As the courier departed, the generals remained motionless, suspended in the terrible waiting that now defined their existence. The seeds of this desperate moment had been planted years earlier, when the triumphant alliance that defeated Hitler fractured into ideological warfare that threatened to consume the world entire. Berlin had been the first true test, the divided city becoming a monument to distrust where concrete walls replaced handshakes, and guard towers sprouted like weeds along a scar cutting through the heart of Europe. General Crawford remembered standing in the western sector 3 years prior, watching East German soldiers string barbed wire, while American tanks idled mere yards away, engines rumbling like caged predators awaiting release. The crisis had passed without shots fired, but the poison it injected into superpower relations had only metastasized, spreading through every diplomatic channel until even routine communications carried undertones of apocalyptic threat. Moscow saw encirclement in every American base, while Washington perceived expansion in every Soviet maneuver, creating a feedback loop of paranoia that fed on itself with terrifying efficiency. What began as political disagreement had transformed into something far more dangerous, a mutual conviction that the other side sought not merely victory, but total domination or annihilation. Then came the Caribbean confrontation, that suffocating October when the world held its collective breath and waited to see if two men's pride would extinguish civilization over an island most Americans could not locate on a map. Admiral Stanton had commanded naval forces during the blockade, his destroyers circling Soviet cargo vessels in a deadly maritime ballet where one miscalculation could trigger the cascade toward nuclear exchange. The tension of those 13 days had aged every man in this room a decade, etching permanent lines into faces that had weathered conventional war without flinching. They had stood down ultimately, both sides claiming victory, while privately acknowledging they had merely postponed the inevitable reckoning. The missiles withdrew from the island, concessions were made in shadows and silence, but the fundamental hostility remained undiminished, perhaps even strengthened by how close they had come to the brink. Trust, that fragile commodity upon which peace depends, had been shattered beyond any hope of restoration, leaving only the jagged fragments of suspicion and fear. Now the arms race accelerated beyond all rational measure, factories on both sides churning out warheads with industrial efficiency that would have impressed the previous generation's tank manufacturers. Intelligence reports stacked on Crawford's desk detailed Soviet advances in delivery systems, their scientists solving the same terrible equations that kept American researchers awake in laboratories hidden beneath mountains and deserts. The numbers were obscene, arsenals capable of destroying the planet multiple times over, as if once was insufficient to satisfy the strategic planner's appetite for assured destruction. Every month brought new deployments, submarines carrying enough firepower to level continents, bombers on perpetual alert mere hours from their targets, missile silos spreading across prairies like mechanical graveyards waiting to birth their terrible harvest. The doctrine had evolved into madness, masquerading as strategy, mutual assured destruction, given the sanitized acronym MAD, by men who apparently appreciated irony even as they drafted scenarios for omnicide. This was the context surrounding their proposal, the accumulated weight of failure and fear that made diplomacy feel less like negotiation and more like desperate prayer. Crawford knew the history, understood how each crisis had hardened positions rather than softened them, how every near miss convinced both sides they needed more weapons rather than fewer. Yet still they tried, because the alternative was accepting that humanity had constructed an elaborate mechanism for its own extinction and lacked the wisdom to dismantle it. The proposal sitting in that courier's briefcase represented either the first step back from madness or the final confirmation that reason had surrendered to the logic of annihilation. The conference room, deep within the Pentagon's restricted corridors, held 15 men whose combined authority could unleash enough firepower to extinguish human civilization before the sun completed its journey across the sky. Cigarette smoke hung in thick layers beneath fluorescent lights that hummed with electrical persistence, casting harsh shadows across faces lined with sleepless nights and impossible choices. General Crawford stood at the head of the mahogany table, scarred by countless coffee rings and the pressed imprints of clenched fists, his uniform crisp despite the late hour, his eyes betraying the exhaustion that no amount of military discipline could fully conceal. The proposal's draft lay before them in multiple iterations, each version reflecting hours of debate that had sometimes descended into shouting matches between men trained to maintain composure under fire. Maps covered the walls showing Soviet positions, overlays indicating blast radiuses and fallout. Patterns that transformed geography into something abstract and terrifying. The air conditioning struggled against the accumulated body heat and tension, creating a stifling atmosphere that made every breath feel labored and significant. This was where empire confronted its limitations, where power acknowledged the existence of boundaries it could not cross without destroying everything it claimed to protect. Colonel Hendricks represented the Hawk faction, his jaw set in permanent defiance as he argued for proposals that emphasized American strength over Soviet comfort. "We cannot appear desperate," he insisted, stabbing his finger against the document that suggested mutual reductions, beginning with tactical weapons in contested regions. Every concession we offer becomes leverage they will exploit, testing our resolve until they find the breaking point where we value peace more than principle. His words carried the weight of combat experience, decorations earned in previous conflicts when enemies could be defeated through superior tactics and industrial capacity rather than merely deterred through threatened extinction. Others nodded agreement, men who had built careers on decisive action and viewed diplomacy as something practiced from positions of overwhelming advantage rather than mutual vulnerability. They wanted proposals that demanded Soviet retreat, that framed de-escalation as something Moscow needed more urgently than Washington, that preserved American preeminence even while acknowledging the mathematics of mutual destruction. Admiral Stanton countered from the moderate position, his voice measured but insistent as he reminded the room of realities that transcended pride and posturing. "Strength means nothing if we lack the wisdom to avoid using it," he said quietly, the conference room falling silent to catch his words. "Every simulation we run ends the same way once the first weapon is launched, gentlemen, and no amount of strategic superiority changes that final calculus." He pushed forward an alternative draft that offered genuine concessions, inspection protocols that would allow Soviet observers at American facilities in exchange for reciprocal access, phased reductions that acknowledged both sides' legitimate security concerns rather than treating only Soviet fears as negotiable. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, not from fear, but from the burden of understanding exactly what failure meant. Having commanded forces during the Caribbean confrontation, when civilization's continuation depended on men choosing restraint over reflex. The moderates surrounding him represented a quieter strain of military thought, professionals who understood that true victory meant avoiding the battle that could never be won. The debate continued through the night as drafts were revised and revised again, each comma and qualifier representing compromises that satisfied no one completely but might, if fortune favored humanity, satisfy Moscow enough to begin the long retreat from apocalypse. They argued deployment schedules and verification methods, debated whether to address ideological differences or focus purely on material arsenals, struggled to find language that conveyed both strength and genuine desire for reduced tensions. Coffee grew cold in forgotten cups, while ashtrays overflowed with the remnants of nervous energy transformed into smoke and ash. Crawford watched both factions, knowing that whatever proposal emerged from this room would be imperfect, perhaps inadequate, but represented humanity's better instincts, fighting against the momentum toward annihilation that both sides had spent years building. The final document emerged from 48 hours of revision, bearing the bureaucratic title Framework for Mutual Strategic Limitation and Verification. Though the men who drafted it understood, this clinical language concealed humanity's most desperate gamble. The proposal opened with preamble acknowledging both nations' legitimate security interests, careful phrasing that avoided either superiority or capitulation, walking the impossible line between strength and accommodation that might allow Khrushchev to accept without appearing weak before the Politburo hardliners, who measured every gesture for signs of Western exploitation. Section 2. Detailed phased reductions, beginning with medium-range systems positioned closest to opponent territories, weapons whose short flight times created the greatest pressures toward preemptive strikes during moments of crisis, when minutes determined whether civilizations survived or perished. The Americans proposed removing their installations from Allied territories in exchange for reciprocal Soviet withdrawals, transforming the most dangerous forward positions into demilitarized zones monitored by neutral observers whose presence might slow the terrible momentum toward miscalculation. The verification protocols filled dozens of pages with technical specifications designed to satisfy military professionals on both sides who understood that trust without confirmation meant nothing in this calculus of survival. American negotiators offered monthly, Inspections at designated facilities, Soviet observers granted access to confirm compliance, while American counterparts performed identical reviews at corresponding installations behind the Iron Curtain. The proposal included photographic evidence requirements, yield limitations on remaining weapons, and communication protocols establishing direct channels between command centers so that accidents or misunderstandings might be clarified before they escalated into exchanges that would leave cities as radioactive shadows. Crawford had insisted on these details, knowing that Soviet military leadership would scrutinize every clause for potential deception, and that only comprehensive transparency might overcome decades of accumulated suspicion that poisoned every attempt at genuine dialogue between the superpowers. The concessions section represented the moderates' victory, acknowledgements of Soviet security, concerns that made the hawks visibly uncomfortable as they affixed their signatures to the final draft. Americans agreed to formal recognition of existing spheres of influence, implicit acceptance that certain regions would remain within Moscow's orbit without Western interference or encouragement of internal resistance movements. The document promised limitations on reconnaissance flights along Soviet borders, reduction in naval exercises near contested waters, and, most significantly, acknowledgement that strategic parity rather than American superiority represented the achievable goal that both nations could accept without sacrificing essential security. These provisions cost nothing in material terms, but represented psychological concessions that traditionalists viewed as surrendering the moral high ground, treating Soviet concerns as equally legitimate rather than demands from an inherently aggressive ideology that respected only strength. General Crawford sealed the proposal in diplomatic pouches that would travel through encrypted channels to the embassy in Moscow, knowing this document represented either the beginning of humanity's step back from the edge or merely an artifact that future historians would examine, while wondering why rational men had believed words on paper might overcome the terrible logic of weapons that existed and therefore eventually would be used. The diplomatic pouches departed Washington on a grey February morning when frost covered the Pentagon's windows like crystallized anxiety, and from that moment, every clock in the building seemed to measure time differently, each second stretching into uncomfortable duration as men trained for decisive action discovered the unique torture of waiting for an answer that might never come. The document would travel first to the embassy compound in Moscow, where intelligence officers would verify the seals remained intact. Then, through Soviet bureaucratic channels, whose opacity frustrated every American attempt at understanding how decisions actually emerged from behind Kremlin walls, where deliberations occurred beyond the reach of satellites or informants. Crawford maintained his vigil in the operations center, where telecommunications equipment hummed with constant updates from monitoring stations positioned around the Soviet periphery. Vast networks of listening posts tracking radio transmissions and troop movements for any indication that Moscow's response might arrive through military action rather than diplomatic reply. The coffee grew cold, in cups forgotten beside maps marked with colored pins representing Soviet divisions, whose positions shifted daily in patterns that analysts struggled to interpret as either routine exercises or ominous preparation. The waiting infected every level of command with a peculiar nervous energy that manifested in obsessive review of contingency plans, already refined beyond any possibility of improvement. Admirals studied fleet dispositions in the North Atlantic, where American vessels shadowed Soviet submarines, both forces maintaining careful distances while prepared to respond within minutes. Should the diplomatic channel collapse into the confrontation everyone feared, but none could prevent. Once the mechanisms of retaliation began their terrible sequence, Air Force commanders reviewed bomber rotation schedules, ensuring continuous readiness without appearing provocatively aggressive. A delicate balance that required aircraft to remain airborne, carrying weapons capable of erasing cities, while flying patterns that might not trigger Soviet defensive responses based on misinterpreted trajectories. The Strategic Air Command published hourly readiness reports that Crawford scanned for anomalies, understanding that equipment failures or human errors during this suspended moment could create incidents that negotiations might not survive. Intelligence summaries arrived throughout, each day bringing fragmentary glimpses of Soviet deliberations pieced together from intercepted communications and diplomatic sources whose reliability remained forever questionable. Analysts reported increased activity around Kremlin offices, where lights burned through Moscow nights, suggesting intensive consultations, though whether these discussions trended toward acceptance or rejection remained opaque behind Soviet security protocols that assumed every word might reach Western ears. The summaries mentioned Politburo meetings extending beyond normal schedules, military advisors summoned for consultations, and cryptic statements in Soviet publications that Kremlinologists attempted to decode like ancient texts whose meanings shifted depending on interpretation. Crawford read these reports knowing they revealed almost nothing, while representing the only window into deliberations that would determine whether his remaining years involved managing a controlled de-escalation or coordinating responses to the unimaginable. Catastrophe everyone had spent careers preparing to prevent. The contingency planning continued in parallel tracks, preparing for acceptance or rejection, dual realities that commanders had to maintain simultaneously without allowing hope or despair to compromise professional judgment. Acceptance protocols outlined verification team deployments, inspection schedules, and gradual stand-down procedures that would require months of careful coordination between militaries whose entire existence had focused on destroying each other. The American proposal reached Moscow through channels worn smooth by years of diplomatic traffic, but in Khrushchev's hands, the document transformed into something heavier than paper and ink, each page representing choices that would define his legacy and perhaps determine whether Soviet citizens would live to remember him at all. He read the terms in his Kremlin office, while winter light filtered through windows, overlooking walls that had witnessed centuries of Russian leaders confronting impossible decisions. The weight of that history pressing down with almost physical force as he absorbed the American conditions that demanded Soviet concessions, his military advisors would immediately denounce as capitulation. The inspection protocols particularly troubled him, imagining American observers walking through facilities that represented decades of Soviet sacrifice and scientific achievement, their presence a humiliation that hardliners would exploit to question his strength. He set the document aside and summoned the men whose judgment he trusted and feared in equal measure, knowing their counsel would push him toward responses his instincts already anticipated, but political survival required him to appear to consider carefully. The Politburo assembled in chambers where Stalin's ghost still haunted every deliberation, old men who remembered purges and understood that perceived weakness could prove as fatal as actual military defeat in the merciless arithmetic of Soviet power. Marshal Malinovsky arrived with briefing folders containing technical assessments that reduced the American proposal to military mathematics, calculations demonstrating how acceptance would compromise strategic positions that Soviet forces had struggled years to establish. The defense minister's presentation emphasized vulnerabilities that inspection teams might exploit, intelligence gathering, disguised as verification, that could provide Americans with targeting data for attacks the proposal pretended to prevent. Khrushchev listened to arguments he had anticipated word for word, watching faces that revealed how thoroughly his commanders rejected any arrangement requiring them to reveal capabilities they had devoted careers to concealing. Behind layers of deception and misdirection. The debate continued through afternoon into evening as Moscow darkness gathered outside windows, voices rising with frustration, as moderates who might have counseled acceptance found themselves overwhelmed by military pragmatists who viewed the proposal as American manipulation designed to achieve, through negotiation, what they could not accomplish through confrontation. Khrushchev recognized the political reality forming around him, like ice crystallizing in winter air, understanding that accepting terms his advisers unanimously opposed would cost him authority. He could not afford to surrender while maintaining control over systems that required absolute obedience to function during crisis. The concessions demanded in the American document might prevent war, but they would certainly provoke internal challenges from men who measured leadership through displays of strength rather than capacity for compromise. The rejection letter drafted itself through collective authorship as advisors proposed language that would close the diplomatic door firmly, while leaving it theoretically possible to reopen should circumstances change. Careful phrasing that preserved Soviet dignity while dismissing American proposals as insufficient to address security concerns that decades of hostility had made permanent features of superpower relations. The encrypted cable arrived at the Pentagon during that peculiar hour when night shift personnel moved through corridors with the hollow-eyed exhaustion of men who had abandoned normal sleep cycles days ago. The teletype machine in the secure communications room, chattering out Cyrillic translations that duty officers recognized immediately as the response they had dreaded. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison carried the decoded message through basement passages where fluorescent lights hummed with electrical tension that seemed to mirror the current running through his own nervous system, his footsteps echoing against concrete walls built to withstand pressures no architecture could truly contain. The duty general read 3 lines before his face transformed into a mask that revealed everything while expressing nothing. Years of military discipline containing reactions that would have paralyzed lesser men confronting the same terrible mathematics. He reached for the red telephone connecting him to senior command staff. Scattered across Washington in homes they had barely visited since the crisis began. His voice steady as he spoke words that would shatter whatever fragile sleep those officers had managed to claim. Within 20 minutes, the operations center, filled with men arriving in various states of dress, some still buttoning uniforms they had thrown on in dark bedrooms, while wives watched with eyes that asked questions military security prevented husbands from answering. Admiral Hendricks entered, carrying the rejection cable that had been rushed to his residence, the paper trembling slightly in hands that had remained steady through Pacific combat operations, but now betrayed the strain of confronting defeat delivered through diplomatic language designed to soften blows that landed with full force, regardless of phrasing. General Powers stood at the strategic display board, where colored pins represented forces positioned across continents and oceans, his jaw working silently as he processed implications that recalculated every assumption underlying the proposals they had crafted with such desperate hope. The room settled into that particular silence unique to military spaces where trained men confronted scenarios their training had prepared them to manage, but their humanity struggled to accept. The chairman read the Soviet response aloud in tones that stripped away diplomatic niceties, revealing the core rejection beneath phrases about insufficient guarantees and unacceptable verification requirements that translated simply into refusal. Someone dropped a coffee cup that shattered against tile flooring with a sound unnaturally loud in the quiet that followed, ceramic fragments scattering like the pieces of carefully constructed plans that now lay equally broken across tables covered with contingency documents suddenly transformed from theoretical exercises into operational necessities. General Curtis approached the wall map and traced supply lines that would activate if diplomacy's failure forced military solutions, his finger moving across ocean, routes and air corridors, with the terrible certainty of a man whose entire career had prepared him for missions he prayed would never receive authorization. The assembled leadership stood surrounded by technology designed to coordinate responses to the unthinkable, but no equipment could process the weight settling across shoulders that carried responsibility for decisions measured in millions of lives rather than tactical objectives achievable through conventional military thinking. They had gambled on Soviet reasonableness and lost, the rejection transforming their operational reality from tense standoff into something far more dangerous, each man calculating privately how many hours remained before circumstances forced choices that would define human history or end it entirely. The debate erupted with volcanic intensity as general powers slammed both palms against the mahogany conference table, the impact reverberating through a room where strategic calculations collided with human frustration that protocol could barely contain. His voice carried the gravelled edge of sleepless nights and extinguished hopes as he declared that Soviet intransigence had demonstrated the futility of approaching ideological adversaries with reasonable proposals they would inevitably manipulate as evidence of weakness rather than strength. Admiral Hendricks countered from across the table with measured tones that somehow conveyed greater anger than shouting, arguing that abandoning diplomatic channels would fulfill Moscow's apparent desire to paint American leadership as warmongers incapable of sustained negotiation under pressure. The exchange escalated as other voices joined, creating a cacophony of strategic assessments and conflicting doctrines that transformed the operations center into an arena where decades of military philosophy clashed against the immediate crisis that permitted no time for theoretical debates. Colonel Bradshaw, from Strategic Air Command, stood at the display board, marking force readiness levels that climbed toward thresholds designed never to be crossed, except in circumstances that now seemed terrifyingly plausible, his pointer tapping against projected timelines with rhythmic insistence that emphasized shrinking windows for coordinated responses. He spoke in clipped phrases about bomber wings, maintaining constant airborne alert patterns, missile crews conducting shortened rotation, cycles that kept fresh personnel at launch consoles around the clock, and submarine deployments extending beyond normal operational limits into positions that maximized response capabilities while minimizing reaction times. The technical language could not disguise the underlying message that military machinery had reached maximum readiness short of actual combat operations, each system calibrated and waiting for authorization codes that senior commanders prayed would remain unspoken combinations locked in safes rather than transmitted sequences that would activate consequences beyond recall. General Thompson from the Joint Staff voiced what others were thinking but hesitated to articulate directly, stating that the rejection eliminated middle ground between unacceptable capitulation and unthinkable escalation, forcing leadership into binary choices that strategic doctrine had always assumed could be avoided through flexible response options, now revealed as comfortable illusions. His assessment landed like a physical blow across men who had built careers on graduated deterrence theories, the words stripping away conceptual frameworks that seemed inadequate when confronted with adversaries apparently willing to risk everything rather than accept compromises that American planners had considered reasonable starting positions for genuine negotiation. The silence following his statement carried weight that pressed against every chest in the room. Someone finally spoke the question, hovering unvoiced above the assembled leadership, asking directly what recommendations they would forward to civilian authority regarding next steps in a crisis that diplomacy had failed to resolve, and the pause before anyone answered stretched into seconds that felt considerably longer the implications materialized like radioactive fallout, settling across strategic assessments that had sustained American military doctrine through decades of theoretical conflict, now transformed into operational reality, demanding immediate responses that permitted no margin for miscalculation. Air Force Chief of Staff LeMay stood near the situation map, where colored pins marked Soviet installations and American assets in configurations that resembled chess positions approaching endgame, though the pieces represented millions of lives rather than carved wooden tokens. He spoke with characteristic bluntness about readiness postures that had evolved beyond precautionary measures into deployment patterns designed for offensive capability, his words stripping away euphemistic language that typically softened discussions about weapons that could erase cities from existence. The assembled officers understood his meaning without requiring explicit elaboration, recognizing that machinery of destruction had reached activation thresholds where simple mechanical failures or communication breakdowns could trigger cascades no human intervention could halt once initiated. Defense condition discussions unfolded with clinical precision that masked underlying terror, each level representing graduated proximity to conflict that strategic planners had designed as warning stages, but now functioned as countdown markers toward irreversible commitment. Colonel Patterson from NORAD headquarters outlined current status at Defense Condition 2, explaining through careful enunciation that only one level remained before full war footing would position every weapons system for immediate launch upon receiving properly authenticated orders. His presentation included timelines measured in minutes rather than hours, response windows so compressed that human deliberation became almost vestigial compared to automated systems designed to execute predetermined sequences faster than conscious thought could process alternatives. The fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across faces, registering comprehension that their theoretical preparations had become operational realities, requiring decisions that would define not just military history, but potentially whether human civilization would continue beyond the coming hours. Admiral Kelso from Atlantic Fleet Command addressed submarine deployments with subdued intensity, describing vessels positioned beneath polar ice and tropical waters alike, each carrying destructive capacity exceeding all explosives used throughout previous human conflicts combined. He referenced encrypted communications, maintaining constant contact with submerged platforms that could independently execute strike orders if surface command structures ceased functioning, a failed deadly architecture that guaranteed retaliation even if initial attacks obliterated Pentagon leadership entirely. The concept of weapons operating beyond centralized control introduced anxieties that traditional military hierarchies found deeply troubling, suggesting that ultimate decisions might devolve to individual commanders making irreversible choices based on fragmented information and assumptions about destroyed superiors. The psychological weight pressed against every conscience as General Bradley articulated what acceptance of diplomatic failure actually meant in concrete terms, forcing abstract strategic concepts into specific scenarios involving incinerated populations and irradiated landscapes extending across continents. His voice carried resignation mixed with determination as he acknowledged that their professional obligations required planning for outcomes that personal morality found abhorrent, a contradiction that would haunt survivors if circumstances permitted survival at all. The room absorbed his assessment in silence that transcended mere absence of sound, becoming instead a void where hope struggled against probability and training wrestled with instinct for self-preservation that recognized no victor could emerge from conflicts waged with weapons designed to ensure mutual annihilation. The rejection's aftermath settled across Pentagon corridors like winter frost crystallizing on steel, transforming strategic doctrines that had governed superpower relations into artifacts of optimism that suddenly seemed quaint against the harsh reality of permanent nuclear standoff. Military planners who had drafted contingency scenarios, assuming eventual diplomatic resolution, now confronted the necessity of accepting perpetual readiness as the defining characteristic of their remaining careers, and perhaps civilization's remaining decades. The maps and projections covering Situation Room walls no longer represented temporary crisis management tools, but instead became permanent fixtures, depicting a world divided into spheres of influence, separated not by ideological preference, but by mutual recognition that neither side could permit the other's dominance without risking species extinction. The psychological adjustment required officers trained for victory to instead embrace stalemate as the highest achievable outcome, a conceptual shift that violated every instinct cultivated through military education, emphasizing decisive action and clear objectives. Within the Kremlin, parallel recalibrations transformed Soviet military thinking as Khrushchev's advisors recognized that their rejection had closed doors neither superpower could reopen without appearing weak before domestic audiences and international observers whose perceptions carried strategic weight. The documents outlining American proposals disappeared into classified archives where they would remain sealed for generations, their specific terms becoming irrelevant compared to their symbolic significance as the last serious attempt at comprehensive de-escalation before both powers accepted permanence of their armed confrontation. Soviet marshals adjusted deployment patterns and training protocols to reflect long-term garrison mentality rather than temporary crisis posturing, acknowledging through budget allocations and personnel assignments that nuclear competition would consume resources indefinitely without producing traditional military victories that previous generations had understood as warfare's natural conclusion. The doctrine emerging from this crucible of failed diplomacy emphasized stability through terror rather than security through strength, a philosophical transformation that redefined military success as preventing conflict rather than winning it. Strategic Air Command revised operational procedures to prioritize communication safeguards and verification protocols over response speed, accepting slightly longer reaction times as acceptable costs for reducing accidental launch probabilities that haunted every commander's nightmares. The concept of deterrence evolved beyond simple threats into elaborate psychological architectures designed to make nuclear exchange appear so catastrophically destructive that rational actors would choose any alternative, regardless of conventional military disadvantages or diplomatic humiliations involved. History would record this moment not as dramatic confrontation, but as quiet acceptance, the point where humanity collectively acknowledged that certain technological developments had fundamentally altered relationships between nations and perhaps between people and their own survival instincts. The Cold War ceased being temporary crisis and became instead permanent condition, a background radiation of existential threat that subsequent generations would inherit as normal despite its unprecedented danger. Military officers retiring decades later would remember not battles fought, but catastrophes prevented, measuring their careers' success by continued existence of cities they had sworn to defend. Through preparations for conflicts they prayed would never materialize into mushroom clouds blooming across horizons. What would you have done if you had been in that situation room facing humanity's darkest hour? Subscribe to explore more untold stories from the Cold War's most terrifying moments.